Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, Michael. What a pleasure to have you here. I've been looking forward to this all week. Both your books are a fantastic read. You have that enviable knack of being able to incorporate copious amounts of research and information into very readable articles and books. They're page turners and also extremely timely on so many levels. If I may, I wanted to start a bit about your journalistic history and journey, because you started off writing about so many different subjects. Your Pulitzer Prize final for the first time piece was your work exposing a lack of housing for the elderly. Second time, again, your work on the lack of equipment for the military, the US military in Iraq. And I know there's an interesting story there about why you had to leave Iraq. But then in 2009, you were given a tip about a story about a contaminated burger. That's the piece that actually won you the Pulitzer Prize. And since then, you have been concentrating on the food industry for now over a decade. So could you tell us a little bit about your journey and also what's kept you writing about the food industry?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And it's so great to join you for this. And thanks for the time. Maybe we could start kind of with the body armor, because in 2008, I was in Algeria interviewing Islamic militants when a couple of FBI agents showed up at the New York Times headquarters in New York looking for me. I'd been traveling to Iraq, looking at the Pentagon's failure to equip American soldiers and Iraqi soldiers with armor, and then kind of looking at more broadly at the war on terrorism, traveling through the Middle East. And according to the FBI agents, I had managed to land myself on an Al-Qaeda hit list, which I mention only because when I was ordered home overnight by the editor of the New York Times, I ended up going from one war to another because I was sitting around with my editor at the Times, thinking of something new to do. And I think I was pitching another story about US arms sales overseas. And she goes, "Well, Michael, what do you think about peanuts?" And I go, come on, get serious here. She, no, listen, hear me out. There's been this outbreak of salmonella in peanuts being manufactured here in the US. And there's like all kinds of people getting sick all over the country and they can't figure out what's going on. And I went and took a look and, it turned out to be this window on this processed food industry that in this case had totally lost control over its food chain because these peanuts were being used in hundreds of processed food products. And the companies didn't even know they were coming from that factory as the outbreak spread around the country. And then I moved to look at E. coli in hamburger. And that became this story about the industry kind of almost intentionally losing control over its food chain in order to sort of avoid costly recalls. And I was having dinner one evening in Seattle with one of my best sources who was testing meat for the meat industry for E. coli. And he said to me, Michael, as tragic as these incidents of contamination are, you really should look at what my industry is intentionally adding to its products. He was worried about all the salt going into processed food. That led me to look at sugar and fat as this kind of unholy trinity that was getting us to like these products. And I was lucky to come across this trove of documents that took me inside the processed food industry, and that became the basis for salt, sugar, fat, which kind of looks at the extraordinary science of the things you can see on product labels, the ingredients in the book. I'm sorry, in the grocery store, in the products. So that's how salt, sugar, fat happened.
Yeah. It is interesting that you have managed to get so much information from the inside. There's a couple of cases where you talk about you're actually invited in by some of these companies to go and talk to them or learn about what they're doing. How have you managed to keep that balance, that you managed to get in there and talk to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, look, I've been crawling through the underbelly of this industry for 10 years now. For me, it's like a big detective story. What I want to do is just figure out how they did it. How did they get us? How do they get us to love their products so much? And so, it's kind of a combination of getting the documents, and that's what I'm trained to do as an investigative journalist, which then kind of identify people in the industry that I try to talk to. And, and I go to them not to not to like opinionate and whatever. It's like so tell me how you really did this. I have this memo you wrote a couple of years ago, or these emails or these white papers, but I want to make sure I get the story right. And so they opened up and talked to me and revealed even more secrets. And I have to say that's been one of the most surprising things, is how many insiders have come to have misgivings about their life work in developing these processed food products. And more related to Hook, the new book, how many of them don't touch their own products for fear of losing control.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go back to the beginning then, and we'll start with the actual product. So ultra processed foods started to emerge 40, 50 years ago, and they were developed to fill the needs of time poor, cash poor, urban consumers. And let's face it, anything that manages to get us less time in the kitchen is a winner. So they were constructed to have attractive tastes, sensation, shelf life. They did that by vastly increasing the sugar, the salt, the fat, but also by adding synthetic chemicals. Now, do you think in the beginning, the knowledge that these foods are bad for our health, do you think that knowledge was there from the beginning, or they actually thought this is something good that we're doing?
I think they thought they were doing good. I mean, they invented the term convenience foods back in the, I want to say, early 60s. In a more innocent era when our dependence on those foods wasn't what it is now. And so that's one way that they could sort of defend themselves. Look, we never intended for people to eat Lunchables day in and day out, or, to spend so much time in the frozen food aisle to get their meals, all their meals from there. So that's one way they kind of justify their effort. And I think that's really true, because if you dial forward from the 60s, when more women began working outside of the house and both parents suddenly had to figure out dinner at 7 o'clock when they're coming home, to the 80s, that's kind of when we went crazy with convenience foods. And in this country, certainly almost overnight, you saw people walking down the street, eating, drinking anywhere, anytime, and parents, no longer telling their kids not to snack between meals. And that took convenience to kind of the height of seduction, if you will, because snacking, certainly in this country, became the fourth American meal. I mean, we're now getting on average 560 calories from snack foods in between meals. And when you look at the comparisons, and I'm getting ahead here though, but between drugs and food, the speed that's built into snack foods is one of the most, kind of stunning revelations.
Definitely. Well, this is really interesting, because I bet there are a lot of people on this call who, when they think of ultra processed foods, they think, oh, well, that doesn't affect me. I don't go down that aisle. I stay with the natural stuff. And one of the statistics in your book, where you tell us that of 33,000 products that are on our supermarket shelves, over 3/4 of those will contain an ultra processed ingredient. So we're talking things like bread, pasta sauces, salad dressings, things that you might go in and think, oh, I'm fine. I cook from scratch, everything. No. So the reach of the ultra processed foods now has gone, like you said, from a few convenience foods. It is absolutely everywhere now, isn't it? It's just in everything.
Yeah, almost without us sort of knowing. And, and even ingredients like sugar that are on the label, we think we can sort of track it. I mean, by one estimate, 3/4 of groceries in the store now have some sugar additive, or increasingly sort of fake sweeteners, which are totally interesting too. Which kind of reflects the companies moving around the grocery store, engineering these bliss points for sweetness in their products. And what does it do? I mean, sort of psychologically, it sort of creates this expectation in us that everything should be sweet. And so when we drag ourselves over to the produce aisle to eat Brussels sprouts, they're going to be like even more bitter than they were before. So the definition of the foods we're talking about, ultra processed food is a good one. convenience foods. I've started to even think about it though as fast food. Not the restaurant stuff, but like fast groceries. And that's another way of dividing things in the grocery store. Like, what am I going to eat just putting my hand in the box? What am I going to eat just like dumping it onto a pan and warming it up? The speed, again, coming back to speed, is I think is a good criteria for the kind of foods we're talking about.
I think it's quite easy for people to understand that evolutionarily we find these ingredients attractive. Well, certainly the salt, sugar, and the fat. That is easy to understand, that we used to want them. With Hooked, your new book, things take a darker turn because you start to focus on the effects these products have on our health. And what is shocking here is about when you talk about the level of addiction, which we've already alluded to, that goes with them. So there's one quote that's being singled out by yourself and also in the media and the papers here, where you say that some of these foods are more addictive than heroin, and that researchers found that food can start to alter the brain in a way that seems to mimic drug abuse. So can I ask you first, how do you define addiction?
So actually, I don't define it. I defer to one of the largest tobacco companies in the world. And this was such a great moment for me journalistically, because when I first looked at the word addiction, I saw this definition with 9 components, including withdrawal symptoms and tolerance thresholds. And I thought, well, yeah, there's no way Twinkies or Oreos are withdrawal really? But then, I discovered that Philip Morris, after decades of vehemently denying that smoking was addiction and comparing smoking to eating processed food, flipped entirely in the year 2000, publicly acknowledged, no bones about it, smoking was in fact addictive. And that same year, the CEO of the company was asked in Legal Precision, so what's your definition of addiction? And he said, addiction is a repetitive behavior that some people find difficult to quit. And I thought that was like so perfect, because it applied to so many things I'm looking at in the grocery store from his own company at that point. And what happened is that over time, even drug researchers came around to embrace that definition, because drugs, act on us in many different ways, and not all drugs have withdrawal symptoms. Yeah. And so that's the definition that I carried forward through the book Hooked.
Okay, that's important, because doesn't necessarily mean that there are harmful consequences to that behavior.
Yeah, although I think when he was talking about it, I think that was sort of understood, because okay. Look, we get addicted to, running and playing the cello, and we don't really care about that. So we're talking about things, yes, that cause us harm. I was really struck by the word some in that definition too, because one of the first things that the food industry said to me in their defense was, how can you blame our products when not everybody loses control of them? And I was like, whoa, you're right. Mm-hmm. And then one of the lessons from looking at smoking, alcohol, drug use is that there are casual users of cigarettes, alcohol, even heroin, who can take it or leave it. And so addiction sort of happens on this spectrum, irrespective of the product too, which is really important, because when we talk about kind of our basic instincts, through the millennia going back, and why it is we're attracted to these products, some of that is on us. Addiction happens in our brain, and it happens differently to different people.
Because this is really important, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Is food addiction actually a disease, or is it a habitual, learned, maybe uncontrollable behavior? Because surely it's a matter of consequence. If I say to you, I happen to know, Michael, I've read somewhere that you are partial to a packet of crisps, chips every now and then. If I say to you, Michael, that's fine, have your crisps, but in 10 years' time, you might have a slightly higher risk of diabetes or cardiovascular disease, you're going to say, fine, I'm fine with my chips, that's okay. But if I said to you, Michael, you eat that packet of chips and you're going to break out in the most horrendous painful boils in the next 10 minutes and your dog's going to get run over and whatever, the consequences are huge, you're going to think again. So surely there is a point where you can say, I mean, yeah, to an individual, this is what's going to happen and something's going to reach them. In which point is that, can you still say that's an addiction? You see what I'm trying to get at?
And I think it depends on the person. I mean, I have been to kind of self-help meetings where people say they are addicted to sugar to such an extent that they can't touch a grain of it without losing control. Now, would they go hold up, a convenience store at gunpoint to get sugar like a heroin junkie might? I mean, who knows? In reality, they don't have to do that because that sugar is so cheap and available. So, we haven't tested it in that regard. But I think the other part of that definition is sort of that loss of control that clearly happens to some people. But then there's a broader kind of loss of control that we're kind of talking about here. I mean, clinical obesity is now 42% of American adults. And that doesn't necessarily, in fact, for most people, it probably doesn't involve like uncontrollable binging, right? It involves kind of this incremental weight gain from an inability to sort of wrest ourselves free of these ultra processed food products, which are designed in a way that gets us not to just eat them, but to overeat on a daily basis. And I think that's the bigger loss of control element of the concept of this food being addictive. That's important certainly from a public health standpoint.
Sure. Well, that is where it gets dark, because you're saying that these food products are being artificially altered, that they know about these addictive pathways, and that the companies are exploiting them and using them as weapons to trick us into buying more and eating more. So can you tell us a bit more about that? What you do?
And right, and that's where I spent time with sort of, again, evolutionary biologists who have sort of studied how we came, our sensory relationship to food. And one of my favorite researchers who's now at Yale, Dana Small, kind of pushed back on the addiction thing a little bit. And she said, look, Michael, it's not that we're addicted to food so much, that we by nature are drawn to food, and the food companies have changed the nature of that food in the past 50 years in a way that our biology hasn't had time to catch up. She sort of views this in the mismatch framework, which I think is really brilliant. So how? So one of the things we're drawn to in food is cheapness. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's the least amount of energy expenditure, right? If you're in a hunter-gatherer society, it makes a lot more sense to, instead of chasing down an impala for dinner, to like grab that aardvark sitting there. So the food companies use chemical laboratories that come up with these incredible formulations. Like, I don't know if this has hit you all yet, but pumpkin pie spice went insane in this country every autumn season. And they would use as many as 80 ingredients to come up with the pumpkin pie spice that they would add to cookies and crackers and candy and coffee and who knows what. Well, their main goal, though, for the processed food industry is to reformulate in order to bring the costs down, even by 10 cents on a package, knowing that cheaper excites us. We're drawn to variety, for another example. Historically, in part because, as we spread around the globe, humans became really good at adapting to like whatever food stuff there was to be eaten, even if it was just whale blubber. We would fall in love with whale blubber and be able to sort of eat that. And so, the food companies, they're all about maximizing the variety of their products. Cereal aisle in this country, you're getting 200 different brands of sugary starch, all sort of like flashing at you in the cereal aisle. And again, that gets the reward center of the brain excited. And another big element is calories. As we evolved, we came to look for calories as much as salt, sugar, fat. And in fact, we have we have sensors in our gut and possibly even in our mouth that tell us how many calories there are in a food. And the more calories, the more the brain wants that food. And so the industry became really good at packing those calories into these dense little packages, which of course has the problem of stimulating the go part of the brain, which is the part that tells us to, wow, I love that, let's get more of that, and kind of lulling the stop part of the brain, the thinking part, the willpower, the executive function, lulling it to sleep. So those are kind of three basic, and there are more, but those are three basic instincts that the industry appreciates and has well, exploited for if you will, to maximize the allure of its products.
Can you see legal cases being mounted here like they have been for tobacco, or are there too many extraneous factors to bring a class against giants?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you asked that, because I opened the book with the case of two teenagers who sued McDonald's, the fast food chain, for making them fat. They were here in New York, and at the time, this was in the year 2000, kind of like the late night talk shows kind of chuckled a little bit and basically said, okay, but come on, you had to know this stuff was bad for you. Everybody knows this is bad for you. The case didn't go anywhere, but they added in an addiction charge, which is, on top of like the nutrients and the lack of nutrients in the food and the seductive powers. We think this stuff is addictive. And the judge got really interested in and said, well, if you can prove addiction, that may get over the sort of the hurdle of your own personal responsibility. And to date, that's kind of been the issue to think about in litigation. To what extent is the victim, if you will, to what extent were they personally responsible for that? And mind you, the tobacco industry went through this as well. They were winning every case brought against them until the plaintiff's lawyers began bringing this question of addiction to jurors. And that's when a light bulb went on among jurors saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe they weren't in control. Maybe there was something in these products, cigarettes, that robbed them of free will. I mean, that said, one of the more devious things that happened is that the food industry was so alarmed by the case brought by these two teenagers that they went around the country enacting laws, and I think they're up to 26, 27 states, barring anybody from suing them for making them fat. You can't even bring a case in those states anymore. So I think the lesson maybe for anybody thinking about litigation is to do what lawyers did with the tobacco companies. In this country, they beat big tobacco in court, not by arguing smoking was bad, but by arguing that there's a huge public health care cost here, and none other than the tobacco companies should be responsible for paying the cost of people getting sick by smoking. You could make that argument with food without being judgmental about their products at all.
Yeah. You raised something just there, and that again is something I wanted to delve into. How much of the responsibility for keeping ourselves healthy lies with the individual, and how much with government? And are individual efforts worth much without state intervention?
Yeah, I mean, the problem that I see now is that, I mean, what we eat, has never mattered more. And I don't think we have time, to wait for the government to sort of step in and intervene. And I know we don't have time for the companies to, do meaning, and we can talk about that question. What do they really have, a meaningful role to play going forward? I think there's some really alarming signs just in the last year or two that they don't, and we can't trust them. So unfortunately and tragically, I think it does come down on us to figure out ways to change what we value in food. And that's really hard, because if you imagine, say, planting a garden in a school so you get young children excited about things like radishes, and they bring those radishes home to their parents who maybe haven't seen one before, and the parent goes to the grocery store looking to buy that radish. In many neighborhoods, they might not be able to find the radish. And even if they can, those radishes may cost as much as a 2-pound, 3 cheese, 4 meat frozen pizza that's going to feed the whole family. And so you have this huge economic disparity, coming out of the entire agriculture system, which is geared toward making ingredients in these ultra processed foods as cheap as possible and paying much less attention to getting us access to super fresh, super yummy, affordable vegetables and fruits.
Yeah, yeah. And actually you talking about young people brings me on to probably the most disturbing part of your research, and that's the advertising and the marketing campaigns. So if I can just throw out a couple of statistics here from the UK, young people in Britain are exposed to 15 billion junk food advertisements a year online, 15 billion. The 5 most watched children's YouTube channels have advertised unhealthy branded items over 20 billion times. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And what it seems that the whole focus is to target and hook children because they're the most vulnerable. That's when we establish patterns of comfort and memory, which can last our whole lives. Like you've just said, I mean, we have the worst child obesity rate in Western Europe. We know what's going on in the States. So what have you found there about the focus of the advertising and the marketing? Is it as bad as I've just portrayed?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a reason why they're doing that. In the first book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, I met and spent time with the former president of Coca-Cola for North America, South America. He walked me through all the things Coke does to get inside our heads, but one of them is to focus on ballparks where kids go with their parents, knowing that if you can get a soda in the hands of the kid at that kind of precious, joyous moment, that experience will get embedded in their brain and get associated with that joyous moment for the rest of their lives. But for Hooked, I spent a whole chapter on memory because that's another way that food is even more addictive, if you will, or problematic than drugs, because food memories are hugely critical to our eating habits. And we start forming those at a really young age, possibly even still in the womb. And psychologists talk about something called the adolescence bump, where we're forming more memories, more powerful and longer lasting in our adolescence years. And so that's prime targeting territory for the food companies in terms of shaping our likes and dislikes in food and getting us brand loyal, as the companies call it.
Yeah. So if they are focusing on young people like that, surely the government has to do something. And then what are their options? Okay, so we ban class 1 narcotics, drugs. But then for lower grades, several countries are now coming around to, let's bring them back. Let's legalize cannabis, but with controls. I mean, that's what we have for gambling, cigarettes, alcohol. We have, it's legal, but with controls. I mean, can you see a world where we start putting an age control on fizzy drinks or sugary cereal? Could we do that?
Boy, that's so hard. I mean, the mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg, tried to do that with these gigantic sodas. And basically he said, we're going to stop selling these monster sodas in like public, places where I can control them. And the pushback on that was incredible, right? People were not ready for that type of government intervention. My sort of thought was, okay, but if you take government out, it's not like you have a level playing field. You're basically just leaving this influence and these decisions in the hands of the soda companies, or kind of more broadly the food companies. The whole question of sort of, do you do soda taxes as a way of sort of nudge marketing? And I think there's sort of some potential there, because look, we love money as much as we love ultra processed food. And it really does seem to work that if you put a few pennies of tax on a product, it almost like it gives us an excuse to say, well, I don't think I'm buying that today. And you can say to your kids, guys, come on. I mean, do you want your allowance this week or don't you? Because this stuff costs more. So I think that can kind of work in ways. But I mean, fundamentally, I still believe that the most powerful force we have going for us is knowledge. You know, knowing what they do is oddly empowering, and finding ways to sort of have that conversation with kids who are still shaping their eating habits is really important. You know, with this caveat that sort of what I learned in Hooked and about the power of some of these products to act like drugs. I mean, I think you have to go a bit further when you're getting these overpowering cravings for foods. And so even mere knowledge can't help you deal with those kinds of situations.
Where should we get that knowledge from? I mean, you walk into a hospital here and the first thing you see is a vending machine full of junk food. We are not getting it from our health professionals. We're not getting it from the doctors. I mean, is it actually acceptable now for any health professional not to talk about obesity, about foods, about nutrition, given COVID, given what's just happened in the last year? Is it still?
No, I think it still is. I mean, maybe doctors are trying now more and more. You know, there's a bit of a fear of fat shaming in this country, certainly, where, you know, you don't kind of want to call somebody obese. It is a disease. So it's, you wouldn't say somebody is cancerous, right? They have cancer. And so there are kind of ways to do that. But I think there's an awakening now, certainly in the medical community, the public health community, that obesity is one of the biggest factors in making us vulnerable to disease like COVID. But it's really hard. I mean, look, it's really hard for doctors to do that. I've been invited. I went to Montreal once to give a grand round before doctors there because they were so concerned about their inability to sort of factor in food to their caregiving. And as you speak, sort of those, as you mentioned, those vending machines, even in a situation like that.
Yeah. Maybe, do you think tech is the answer? I mean, you know, we've got some apps and gadgets that either record a few of our genetic variations or a patch to monitor your blood glucose, ref monitor for metabolism, or something like that. And there's Tim Spector's Zoe app. I don't know if you're familiar with that. He's a professor here. It's launched in the States, but not in the UK, where they are going to try and personalize food suggestions by looking at, I think, the microbiome and a blood sample, things like this. We've got several apps and gadgets coming along, you know, so forget government, forget education, you just go along and you point your phone at something and it says, no, Michael, step away from the salted caramel ice cream. Is that the answer? Is that something that could help?
Maybe. I mean, I would find it difficult to sort of use an app like that. But look, I mean, I walk in the grocery store and I like start laughing because I kind of know all the tricks that the companies are playing to get me to like grab their product and put it in my basket. I did hear of an app that really intrigued me. And so this was from a researcher out in Oregon, and I'm pretty sure it's been developed in the UK as well. And it's to help people kind of change how they value food in the spur of the moment of a craving. And so it's a little app that they've designed where you repetitively get a go or a stop sign relating to food. And so you see a healthy salad, you press go, green, and you see some junk food and you press stop. And the idea is that we have a lifetime of accumulating bad habits that the food companies have been putting there, deepening those memory channels so that we become more sensitive to their advertising even as we gain weight. And so this is an attempt to sort of carve some new channels in our brain so maybe we can lessen that spontaneous reaction we have to those cravings. And you know, they're talking about using this app for hours and hours at a time to retrain how the brain responds, you know, just to seeing junk food or a salad. So, you know, that's kind of intriguing. If I was king for a day, I would recreate home economics in schools. maybe in a cool kind of new way where you're talking about food in a political sense with kids, and teaching them, how to cook, how to shop, how to plan. That seems to be one of the things that we've really lost control of, or ability to do, which is to, on a Sunday evening, make a menu for the week and think about and organize, that, so you don't, spin out of control, having to shop at the last minute or think of interesting menu items. So that's certainly one of the things I would love to see happen
Yeah.
globally, is kind of, reweaving, as it used to be, food into the school curriculum.
Absolutely. I think it's criminal that we don't have that anymore. I mean, I do remember I'm old enough to have gone through home economics, and I remember making ridiculous things like pineapple upside down cakes, rock cakes, and things. But even so, it taught you, I wasn't afraid of the kitchen, and I kind of knew how an oven worked and things like that. I agree. You speak about things worldwide. I'm kind of curious about the cultural international angle here, because there are some countries who have managed to kind of embrace advertising. They have all the products. I'm thinking here of Southeast Asia, places like Japan, Vietnam, who have had far fewer deaths from COVID and have far less obesity problems. Somehow, despite having all the advertising and the products available to them, they've managed to keep more of their traditional nutrition eating culture, which we have to do. So yeah, I'm interested in whether you have any kind of thoughts on that, and whether it means it's all lost for us because we just.
I mean, my thought is how frustrating it is to be kind of writing in this field, seeing so much undone research and undone science. I mean, who has gone in there to sort of look at that? Like, what are all the factors in those countries that's sort of creating that situation? It's not being done. Obesity in this country started in 1980, and just 2 years ago now, 2019, for the first time, a scientist at the NIH in Washington, for the first time, did a randomized control study where he took two groups of people, put them in an eating lab for 2 weeks, totally monitoring their input, output, and put them on two different diets. One was ultra-processed food, one was food cooked by scratch. And guess what happened? The ultra food diet folks gained weight. It was the very first time that we were able to see that there was a causal, not just associative, linkage between these ultra-processed foods products and gaining weight. Now, we kind of knew that, but it's really important to do that fundamental research in order to drive policy, because now you can go to policymakers and say, here it is, here's the science, what's your excuse for not acting now? And the industry is petrified by that kind of science. But my point is, I'd love to see so much more of that kind of research done.
Yeah, I actually have a question here. You mentioned evolutionarily, we are attracted to calorific foods. Do you think that'll continue? I mean, we've got a calorie dense world. Do you think, is there any way we can beat that, or is that just
well, not to be too depressing, right? But so going back in time, one of the goals in dealing with food and becoming attracted to it was to put on body fat, lots of body fat. Compared to other mammals, we were the fattest creatures in the world, and that had a huge benefit. It enabled our brains to grow. It enabled us to get through hard times. Most important, evolutionarily, it enabled us to have more babies, right? And that fat, though, what I didn't realize until looking at Hooked and talking to researchers, is that fat is an organ that thinks, talks, communicates to the rest of the body. And so, and its sole mission in life is to defend itself from attack. And so when you decide to diet to lose weight, your worst enemy in that is kind of your own body fat, because it's sending signals to the brain saying, you're hungry. It's telling your metabolism, resting metabolism that burns a certain number of calories even when we're sitting or sleeping, to slow down and burn less calories. And and kind of most critically too, going back to the researcher in Oregon who had that app to sort of change how we value food, he discovered for the first time by following some young people over time that as those among them who gained weight, they became more sensitive to cues for food, what psychologists call cues, what we call advertising.
Yeah.
And that kind of explains why two people driving down the road and see us, advertising for fast food, they could have very different reactions. But he found that as we gain weight, the brain becomes even more excited about those food products that caused us to gain weight. And so, we're coming back to that free will. It's even more difficult for us to try to turn the corner and change things for ourselves because of our own biology that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Which was perfectly fine and great up until 50 years ago when suddenly body fat became a problem.
So let's go back to the companies there. And there's another question here. Obviously, we have a lot at the moment about the climate emergency, and companies are having to incorporate that, think about that, change their whole approaches. Do you think there's this broader movement? You've got stakeholder capitalism, you've got companies having to incorporate information and fears about climate and the environment. Do you think the same thing could happen here with this problem, that they are going to have to acknowledge this is a problem and do something about it? Do you think
I think that, right. So I think the food industry is like a lot of industry. They tend to go through phases. And the first is like denial. Second is kind of like delay. Let's try to okay, we kind of get this, but let's put it off for a few years. And then the third phase is kind of like this capitulation or yielding that, okay, you got us. You're right. It's addictive. We need to do something about it. And they're kind of in that phase now because it was just a couple of years ago, it was after Salt, Sugar, Fat came out, more and more people started to care, and I'm not taking credit for this, it was just a moment in time, more and more people were caring about what they put in their bodies and translating that into purchase decisions. The companies grew alarmed that the sales of some of their junkiest items were starting to decline, and they got together to figure out how they can win back our trust. I mean, they actually said publicly, we're losing the trust of our customers. And so they started thinking of ways that they can regain that trust. And it sounded kind of good, but when you looked at what they've done, it's a little disturbing. So one thing they've done is to add more protein to some of their products, like sugary cereals, because protein may have some satiating powers, but that's a little mushy, and it's probably in some situations, and that kind of overlooks the whole thing of the sugary starch that you're eating with that protein. Well, for the same reason they started adding fiber to their products, even though a lot of that fiber was made in the laboratory and had never been shown to have any satiating qualities that we associate with fiber. And more recently, kind of with the pandemic, right? I mean, we thought with the pandemic that at least we could have a chance to kind of start changing our relationship with food by getting away from the vending machine. But a lot of us ended turning our own kitchens into vending machines, because what happened is we went into the grocery store and those childhood memories came flooding back, and the food companies noticed that we were buying products we hadn't had since we were kids. Their snack sales soared, the stress, emotion of the moment. But here's the other thing that's happened is that the snack food companies took control of the snack aisles. So, the yeast got out of stock. We had flour shortages here. We had shortages of canned tomatoes, but snack foods, chips, candies, no way. Those shelves were stocked continuously because the food company representatives went into the grocery stores and made sure those shelves were stocked. So this is an industry that on one hand says it wants to start doing the right thing by our health, and on the other hand is, caught in a situation that frankly all companies are, which is needing to sell as much product as possible. And so I think that's and in their case, being dependent on these kind of fundamental things, cheap, convenient, irresistible. Those are the hallmarks of their products, and it's still an open question whether they can truly change that.
Yeah, no, this is so important. We could talk for a lot longer. I'd like, whether they can actually change their products if it means that their profits are going to suffer. Are the shareholders going to allow that? I mean, there's so much more, but I am conscious of time. So I want to ask you one final question. What gives you hope?
So it's this crazy idea, and it just sort of came up not long ago, where I just had this kind of epiphany that a lot of these things I've been writing about the processed food industry are not things they invent themselves. They didn't invent salt, sugar, fat, or our attraction to cheapness and variety and calories. They kind of took that from us and turned it to their advantage. So I'm kind of thinking maybe there are ways we can turn the tables on the industry and take back things they took for us. And it's the tiniest example. It's not going to change anybody's life. But in our house, we've managed to go from drinking soda to plain seltzer, because the brain somehow, scientists are still working on this, but we get excited by bubbles almost as much as we do by sweetness, which is kind of weird because there's like a little bite in seltzer. But think about it, seltzer existed long before the soda companies started dumping a bunch of sugar in it, right? There's a town in Germany named Seltzer because they were like connoisseurs of plain seltzer water. So I love this idea of even using high technology. Take freezing, right? Freezing started out as a method to preserve the vegetables. Companies turned it into like this glutton of TV dinners in the frozen food aisle. Well, now there are farmers using high technology freezing to preserve really great fruits and vegetables. So I love this idea of reclaiming what they took for us, and that gives me lots of hope.
Okay, brilliant. Michael, I know you've got several more of these interviews today, so we won't take up any more of your time, but thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating, and I wish you all luck with Hooked and hopefully many more of your future books. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really, really great talking to you.
Bye-bye.